for the information, Vanessa. I'm very pleased to have this few minutes to share with the participants of this very nice workshop in Waterloo on some collaboration that I've been pursuing over the past couple of years with two co-authors who are practitioners in two global banks in London. And the title is both a reflection of this collaboration, but also the hope for further collaboration between academia and industry on research that concerns the climate and the role finance and mathematical finance can play, obviously in a positive way. So, the two co-authors are Chris Kenyon and Murat Berahui, and we've been working on three papers, one of which, the first one here listed, has recently been published in Risk Cutting Edge, which is the premier outlet for the financial industry globally. And one of our main goals was to drive and also direct the conversation within the financial industry global when it comes to climate finance, and in particular the role that the financial industry can play in the discussion about how to go about the reduction of carbon emissions and the financing of it. And you'll see also two following papers here where we introduce the carbon equivalence principle, to which I'm going to come shortly, and another piece of work on a new valuation adjustment that is reserved for the carbon externalities and the costs associated to it when it comes to reevaluating existing financial products, which need to be adapted to the fact that there is a carbon price exposure, to which I will also come in a moment. And then I'd like to mention some work with Mateusz Grosselli of McMaster University. This is in a preliminary stage that deals with the green hedge business, as in how to hedge when carbon emissions are actually present and taken care of in a stock flow consistent macro economy. So the goal here that I'm going to focus on is how a carbon equivalence principle can be designed such that it aligns incentives to achieve sustainable financial designs and behavioral change. Both have been mentioned before yesterday and the day before, I believe, in the introductory presentation, are of course very important topics. So what is the carbon equivalence principle? And you might be expecting perhaps from me lots of equations, but if that is the expectation, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you, because I'm going to have exactly one, and it's not on this slide. The reason is that when I started sitting down with the two practitioners, Chris and Murat, we found out that we actually first needed to set the scene, as it were, in mathematical terms. Define the axioms. What are the main assumptions that will drive our collaboration, and what do we think is actually missing in the financial industry, and perhaps even further. So this is how we came up with what we now call the carbon equivalence principle, which has two items. There is more in the paper, but these are the two most important, and I will just read out loud what they are. So the first principle concerns what it is. So the carbon equivalent emissions carbon equivalent sequestrations, which are enabled possible, cost by means that the carbon emissions are required for the life cycle of the financial product itself. This was mentioned earlier in the talk of Professor Weber as direct and indirect emissions. This is what we call here enabled by the financial product, or cost, because the financial product, its life cycle, its existence requires the emission of CO2 equivalent. The second point is how. So how this linkage is actually obtained. So all financial products shall include the enabled or cost carbon equivalent impacts as part of their definition. So when a term sheet is written down, when a contract is written down for a financial product, then the enabled and cost carbon emissions or sequestration must be made part of the definition of the financial product itself. These carbon equivalent term sheets shall be compatible with existing financial position keeping systems, such that it is of no concern for existing financial systems to actually incorporate the carbon footprint, both enabled and cost by the financial product. What is the implication of these two points? Well, that all financial products are now linked to climate change, if climate change is understood, as I believe we all do, as a result of the carbon emissions. So the CEP implies that all financial products have environmental climate impact in as much as they enable or cause increased or decreased atmospheric carbon. So then we had to start focusing on terminology, because we found out that not everybody, not every stakeholder may have the same understanding when mentioning the words carbon price or emissions price. So we then went and did our own studies and concluded that our working definition of a carbon price is the price for avoided or released CO2 equivalent emissions, which this also may include as a proxy the rate of a carbon tax or the price of an emissions permit that helps or quantifies the level of effort in mitigating the emissions or the effort associated with sequestrating carbon. The next piece of terminology is the mitigation of carbon obligation, very important in the financial industry, which here is used to indicate the cost to the company emitting CO2 of fulfilling an obligation either to pay the NGFS carbon price or to sequester an equivalent quantity of CO2. Now, NGFS here stands for Network for Greening the Financial System, and it was mentioned earlier, and we will make use of their scenarios. And I heard that there are various views on the usefulness of scenarios, but I hope I will be able to make this clear in the remaining time. So we assume that the company emitting CO2 equivalent is mandated either to pay the carbon price as reflected by NGFS scenarios going forward, or to sequester an equivalent CO2 quantity to offset. The third piece of terminology, this is new, is what we call the financial net zero concept. This is introduced to indicate that a company has fulfilled its obligation to either pay the NGFS carbon price or to sequester what is needed in order to offset an equivalent quantity of CO2 emitted, and that the company has taken mitigation actions such that the net cost of fulfilling the mandated mitigation carbon obligation is achieved together with the mitigation actions that will result in a zero cost. So that's financial cost, that is, and that's why we call it financial net zero, which is not the same as carbon net zero, but it reflects itself in terms of a portfolio management that then may have as a goal financial net zero that in addition can incorporate carbon net zero or can accept a certain level of carbon net positivity or even lead to a carbon net negative position. So a few words about the NGFS scenarios. So the NGFS has partnered with expert groups of climate scientists and economists to design a set of hypothetical scenarios. And hypothetical here is really important. These provide a common and up-to-date reference point for understanding how physical risk and transition risk may affect financial positions and costs associated with the carbon equivalence principle or reflected in our work through the carbon equivalence principle for different scenarios in the future. Each scenario is chosen to show a range of higher or lower risk outcomes. And they are seen by the network, which, if I remember correctly, includes 140 plus financial institutions worldwide and various other stakeholders, gives a common basis, a common framework to understand what the various relationships may be in between the various components of the underlying models that give rise to the NGFS scenarios and assumptions of how the various components driving climate change may be interlinked. Scenarios, and this is perhaps the most important sentence here, are neither predictions nor forecasts and are just used to provide a
Not sure if we lost our connection with Andrea.
Yes, we have, actually, that's what. Paul, would you like us to wait for him to join back?
Yeah, we'll just give a moment. I have had the experience of my.
I'll just recap this slide very quickly. I was just saying that these are the scenario provided by the NGFS, and they correspond to three types of futures: orderly, disorderly, and hothouse worlds. And you can see the scenarios that correspond to the level of global warming. And associated to it, you have the progressions of the carbon price developments. So these are precisely the scenarios that we have considered in order to calculate what would be the cost liability that would arise to a financial investment or project finance if the carbon footprint that the project finance or the rollout of the infrastructure would entail. So here we have the one equation that I had promised, and you see that essentially we have a discount factor. And of course, this can be part of the modeling decision of how one wants to discount the future. We have the carbon flow. So this would be the amount of carbon carbon emission or sequestration that is involved, and the cost in tons for the carbon that is being emitted or sequestrated in a scenario little omega. So this little omega could be exactly one of the scenarios that you saw earlier. And we focused on particular types of electricity generation. And you can find from the US Energy Information Administration all that you need to know in order to find out what carbon emissions are actually produced when deciding what type of electricity power plant one wants to either finance or keep financing, including the tonnage of carbon per year that, say, coal with or without carbon sequestration includes. So the important slide is this one, perhaps, where one can see that over the period of time of 10, 20, 30, or for the whole lifetime of the power plant, if the carbon flow is actually included in the pricing of, say, a bank loan that is required in order to finance the various types of electricity production, one can see that in the various NGF scenarios, if the transition to low carbon is delayed, one can see that over 10 years, one acquires a spread associated with the carbon exposure in terms of carbon price that one will have to pay of 30 basis points. but it becomes quite extreme for ultra supercritical coal without CCS, so without carbon storage and capture of 5,000 basis points. And if one were to consider the extra spread on the loan over the lifetime of the power plant, then we would have more than close to 12,000 basis points. So this is to say that essentially anything that is based on combustion, anything that burns any fuel apart from a nuclear, will become quickly non-viable, financially non-viable. And this is our way of explaining and seeing very quickly how one can invest in what will become a stranded asset because financially just no longer viable. And of course, the opposite is true for renewable energy, where one can see, for instance, that for wind, onshore and offshore, the extra cost is mainly focused on building the actual infrastructure, but then there is very little by way of carbon emissions and cost associated to it. And there is lots of maths one can do. I didn't show you all the maths that one can do because it's already a challenge to understand where to put the maths, because one has to understand first the problem, and in particular how the financial industry has the means to really make an impact. And this preliminary research clearly shows that by linking all financial products to the actual footprint, carbon footprint that they enable or cause, will make a very important impact and will inevitably change behavior because it will make decisions, investment decisions. It will alter these decisions and finance projects that will, of course, not lead to stranded assets in the future. And here you can see an array of problems and research areas where, of course, mathematics and statistics play a major role in making sure that the outcomes and results are based robustly on scientific grounds and supported by mathematics and statistics. And I think I must stop here not to eat into anyone else's time. And thank you for your patience while I was offline.
Okay, thank you, Andrea.